Good morning. Good morning. Thank you, Mark, and thank you to the Latitude team for having me. So what I'd like to do this morning is to take a deep dive into the future. I'd like to take a deep dive into the future. But as the author William Gibson said, the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. The future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. So as you think about the future and how it impacts your customers, your own companies, and your own professional career, it's worthwhile just to look around you and see if you can see the visions of the challenges that you'll be facing. Let me start off with some questions. How many of you in the last day or so have used Facebook? How many of you have called an Uber? Raise your hands, thanks. How many of you have tried Airbnb? And here's the really tough question. How many of you in the last 10 minutes have checked an app on your smartphone? Right. So 10 years ago, almost none of these capabilities existed. Almost none of these capabilities existed. The iPhone came out 10 years ago. Right. And now, these capabilities represent some of the most valuable companies in the world. The most valuable companies in the world. Apple, $800 billion in valuation. The largest company in the world, most valuable company in the world. Facebook, $500 billion in valuation. Easily the largest media company in the world. Uber, the last round, was valued at about $60 billion. Its competitor Didi in China is valued at about the same. And Airbnb, last capital raise was about $30 billion. Collectively, these capabilities that did not exist 10 years ago are worth about $1.4 trillion in market valuation. Market valuation. And that's a testament, right, to the stark opportunities that are available to you if you, your companies, your customers disrupt the status quo. If you take advantage of the capabilities afforded by new technology before your competitors do, and create those new capabilities. But we all know that innovation is really hard. Almost a third of those companies that were on the Fortune 500 list 10 years ago are no longer there. And 10 years from now, easily, probably a third of companies that are on the list today won't be there 10 years from now. How many of you are satisfied with the innovation performance inside your companies? Not many. A global study by McKinsey last year showed that 94% of business executives were dissatisfied with the innovation performance inside their companies. Dissatisfied. And this is the topic that I've been working on my entire career. I've written 4 books at the intersection of technology and strategy. And what I want to do today, this morning, is to draw from those books and offer you 5 lessons. 5 lessons in terms of how you can take those new capabilities and apply them to your business. 5 lessons on what separates the winners from the losers from an innovation standpoint. So, the first lesson is to embrace the gap. And this is the gap I'm talking about. It's the gap between the natural inclination for companies, successful companies such as yours, to want to change incrementally, to work on incremental, faster, better, cheaper versions of your own products, your own technology. And it's a very rational kind of thing to do, right? Because you're optimized around your current products, your current people, your current skill sets, your current customers and their demands. So faster, better, cheaper is absolutely necessary. But at the same time, technology improves exponentially and will continue to do so. So over time, markets abhor vacuums. Right? So over time, someone will step in and take advantage of new capabilities to build new products that disrupt existing ones, that are better than faster, better, and cheaper versions of existing ones. And that gap, that is the opening for killer apps. Disruptive new products that create new categories and disrupt pre-existing ones. So if you look at the history of technology, Kodak invented the digital camera. They hold a patent, 1985, on the core sensor inside a digital camera. And they spent the next 25 years not ignoring digital photography, but investing heavily on using digital photography to augment their film, chemical, and paper business. Right, as late as the late 1990s, they spent $500 million to launch a new camera system called the Advantage that had a screen and digital sensors embedded in it. And you know what that screen and that sensor allowed you to do? Well, it didn't allow you to capture the picture. It didn't allow you to transfer the picture. It allowed you to preview the picture so you can tell the photo processor how many copies, how many prints you wanted. That's because Kodak was in the business of film, chemical, and paper. Right? So they were augmenting their existing business as opposed to saying, well, what if we just took all this stuff away, like everybody else was eventually going to do? And they wrote off $500 million on that project. And there's the graveyard of history of business is littered with ruined companies that innovated faster, better, cheaper, but were wiped out by those who embraced the same capabilities for disruptive new technologies. Borders, Blockbuster, Yahoo, all these are great companies that did great things and no longer exist. So if you look at the landscape of the future today, these are the technologies that are disrupting every information-intensive industry. Mobile devices, cloud computing, Internet of Things, AI, artificial intelligence, big data. These are all the capabilities you're going to be talking about at this conference for the rest of the week, all augmented and accelerated in terms of adoption by social media. Every information-intensive industry, including yours, will be affected in some dramatic way by these technologies over the next near-term time frame. So how do you deal with it? So lesson number 2 is that the first thing you have to do when you think about these capabilities is to think big. And by thinking big, I mean that from a planning standpoint, you have to explore the whole range of strategic options. You have to be willing to say, how might somebody else take these technologies and disrupt my business to do things that I'm not doing? All the way to, how do I start from a clean sheet of paper and reimagine my business using these capabilities? Because planning is all about exploring a wide range of options and not narrowing yourself in too early. So as a case example, I want to take a deep dive into cars and transportation. 3 reasons for that. 1, this is an industry that's essentially been run by the same companies for the last 100 years. So if disruption can happen in auto and transportation, it can happen anywhere. Secondly, it's an industry that we all very well understand from a consumer standpoint, from a buyer standpoint, so we can relate to it. And third, of course, it's an industry that it will have a dramatic impact on you and your business. What happens in this market will ripple through both to affect customer behavior and many of the core technologies that you use. So one way of thinking big about transportation is to do what we have talked about already this morning, which is to transform the user experience. So just imagine, no more standing in the rain, hoping that some random cab will come by and stop for you. Right? Instead, you get to pick up your phone, call a cab, know exactly when it's coming, who the driver is, what route it will take, how much it will cost. You don't have to fumble around with cash or a credit card. The driver doesn't have to fumble around it. That's embedded into the transaction. A much more simple transaction, providing essentially the same service that companies have been providing for as long as there have been cars. But in a way that just makes it so much easier for the customer. And in a few short years, this provision of a similar service, but reimagined in terms of how it does, has dramatically disrupted that market. In July of this year, Uber overtook taxicabs in New York in a few short years, simply by reimagining the customer experience using what was, by the time it started, relatively mature technologies. That's the great opportunity. And we all talk about changing the customer experience. But oftentimes, when we talk about changing the customer experience, we say, how would it be easy for me to change the customer experience as opposed to what could the customer have if we could give him anything he or she needed? Right? Because the flip side of not doing it is to be on that yellow line, right? To be the New York City taxi cab that suddenly has a new competitor coming out of nowhere, overtaking. But of course, the customer experience in terms of cars and transportation is much worse than just standing in the rain waiting for a cab. Each year, just in the US, more than 30,000 people die in car accidents. Almost 2.5 million injuries in more than 6 million accidents involving more than 10 million cars. Worldwide, more than 1 million people die each year, and more than 50 million people are injured in auto accidents. The economic cost of that is dramatic. Direct costs of more than $270 billion in the US, and if you factor in quality of life, almost $900 billion. And more than 90% of that is due to human error. Now, one way of thinking about human error is that it's the poor customer experience, it's the poor interaction of our customers with our products that kills millions of them. So if you can think about it from that standpoint, how might you apply these technologies to eliminate that bad customer experience? How might you even transform the core product? And that's the great race for driverless cars, motivated initially by the folks at Google who said, hey, if we take the driver out of the loop, as opposed to think about all those incremental additions that can make driving more safe, how could we dramatically affect that number of accidents? And of course, it's all happening faster than any of us would have expected. Volvo has said that by 2020, no one will die in their new cars. GM and Ford have each invested more than $1 billion getting into the race for autonomous vehicles. Cruise, the startup that GM bought, along with GM, has just announced that they have production-ready cars, that they actually have retooled a factory to build driverless cars and ready for reproduction. And what I think is the strongest testament, Boston. How many of you have driven in Boston? Boston has started testing driverless cars. My view is that if it can work in Boston, it can work almost anywhere. That's how fast this is moving. And this is what it looks like now.
Since 2009, our team at Google has been developing fully self-driving technology and testing it on real city streets every single day. Until, after more than 1 million miles, we were ready to take a big step forward. In 2015, we completed the world's first truly driverless ride on public roads. Just a person in a car, no steering wheel, no pedals, navigating everyday traffic.
Well, I've never been in Austin, Texas. Now I'm driving in Austin, Texas. It's a profound experience for me to be alone in a car. A very important segment of my life was cut away when my vision failed, and a self-driving car would give me a huge part of my life back.
This is just the beginning.
That was in 2015, and a lot has happened since then. And you've seen a lot of demonstrations now from a number of providers on the building and testing of these vehicles. It's happening much, much faster than anybody would have anticipated. Now, if you could actually change that core product, if you could take the driver out of the loop, that allows you to think even bigger. So how many of you own a car? How many of you own 2 cars? How many of you own 3 cars? How many of you own 4 cars? So if you had at your option an Uber-like service, 15-minute response times at about 20% of the cost of car ownership, could you imagine not buying that 4th car? Not buying that 3rd car? So there's this opportunity to say, what if we shifted the business model from selling cars to selling mobility? Right? Cars are oftentimes the second largest purchase that we make. Right? There's enormous upfront costs. It starts depreciating as soon as we leave the showroom. We have to pay for insurance. We have to sit in the DMV. We have to deal with maintenance. There's a lot of transaction costs in cars. Right? But we buy them because we might need them once in a while. Cars on average sit unused 95% of the time. So if you could take the friction out of a mobility service, a taxi service, whatever you want to call it, it becomes much more attractive. And the business opportunity for essentially riding that exponential and saying, let's imagine not being just in the business of selling cars, $500 billion in car sales each year in the US, and start thinking about selling mobility. It completely reshapes that industry and offers an enormous opportunity. In the US each year, we drive 3.2 trillion miles. 3.2 trillion miles. Imagine 10% of that at about $1.50 to $2 per mile. That's a $500 billion opportunity. Those are the kinds of numbers that we're talking about. And that's why you're seeing this enormous rush to get into driverless cars by the OEMs, Silicon Valley, everywhere. It's why you see a dizzying series of alliances between ride-sharing companies and driverless car companies. It's why GM is spending so much money, billions of dollars, on driverless cars, with a key focus to provide not to first sell you those cars, but to sell you mobility services. It's why Ford recently fired its CEO and made its head of autonomous development the new CEO. Right? Massive opportunities. And of course, as you think about the opportunities there, just in that part of the value chain, there are enormous ripple effects, both opportunities and challenges flowing out. Right? Who manages this fleet of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of driverless cars? How do you service them? How do you track where they are? How do you get them to the right spot? Who cleans them if something happens in the car? How does it transform, looking further down the value chain, how does it transform distribution, logistics? How does it transform the nature of business all along that continuum, including your business? How does it change industry boundaries? These are kinds of questions that merely happen as you start transforming, as you start taking these technologies and applying them to transform the core product and the core business models. And there's a massive fight now for who captures the value. Right? Who's playing defense and who's playing offense? Those rules are still being figured out. So lesson number 3, after you think big, is to start small. Right? To not fall in love with your idea, but to break it down and to think about how do we take this idea and test it. Not to base our actions on intuition, not to base our actions on hope, but base our actions on data. So oftentimes when I talk to audiences like this and executives like you, and I say, think big, the reaction often is, think big? My problem is not thinking big. My problem is thinking too big. I have too many ideas. How do I sort them out? And let me give you a framework for thinking about that. So the problem of too many ideas. They're coming from everywhere, mostly from the very smart people inside your organization. Here's one way of thinking about how to focus on that small number of really big ideas. One way of thinking about it is that there are 3 categories of big ideas you can think about. There's what I call stay in business, the infrastructure and government-mandated kinds of things you have to do. There's the return on investment. That's your business today and how you make money today. And there's the option-creating investments, those things that build capabilities for the future. Option-creating investments aren't the things that actually return value today. They don't generate financial return today, but they build the capabilities, the platforms for ROI investments in the future. You take these 3 categories, and then you cut across it And this is a key thing to do. Remember what Wayne Gretzky said? Don't go where the puck is, go where the puck is going. Well, one of the things that one of the mistakes that companies make when they think about innovation is they often evaluate innovation ideas and potential projects in the context of what they do today. They ask, well, how much better is this from what I'm doing today? And sometimes when it's significantly better, they do it. But they fail to ask, well, where's the competition? And even more importantly, where's the competition going to be once I'm done? Right? Because competition is always moving. So once you chart out your ideas, then some natural things happen. You certainly shouldn't invest in option-creating investments that have no hope of beating the competition. You shouldn't invest in things on any category that are disadvantaged from a competition standpoint. And the rest of these, you sort of know how to evaluate. Right? So ROI investments, whatever the right metrics and hurdle rates are inside your organization, I mean, these are the investments that are in the time window in which there's enough data for you to evaluate the return. Some things you have to do, whether from infrastructure or government requirements. The thing you want to do there, though, is you want to say, I need here to minimize cost and minimize risk. This is not about building the best infrastructure I can. It's about building the infrastructure that I need and can use. And you have to be really careful when people make the argument to you that infrastructure by itself is an enabling or a differentiating capability, because that might be true, but it has to be evaluated in the context of those ROI investments. So yellow here means caution around those. And from a big disruptive innovation standpoint, what you're looking for are things in the upper quadrant. You want to say, what are those small investments I can make? They're high risk, but they're also potentially high return. They're like financial options, right? They give you the option to explore a space that might be valuable to you in the future. High risk, high return, small amounts that allow you to explore but don't commit for you to make the big investments overall. So how you sort through all of this is important. And over time, you have to remember that killer apps aren't made in one big step. Disruptive innovation isn't done in one big step. It's about looking at a range of possibilities, exploring them over time, and then evaluating whether or not they can be turned into ROI. And how you balance this portfolio depends on your company, your circumstances, but ultimately, what you want is an innovation portfolio that allows you to invest aggressively in infrastructure and in enabling infrastructure that leads you into the future. Spend most of your investments on making money today and spending little bits on exploring future opportunities, having that basket of killer options for going into the future. And once you identify what those options might be, then you take this opportunity to learn fast. Because the companies that innovate successfully are the ones that take a scientific approach to innovation. Right? Big companies like to do big planning. But the thing you don't want to do is to say, here's a great idea. Here's my 5-year plan. Here's my roadmap. And here are the billions of dollars I'm going to spend to build it. You do it a little bit at a time. You take the attitude that my friend Gordon Bell has, which is that a demo is worth 1,000 pages of a business plan. Don't fall in the trap of doing big planning. Don't fall in the trap of building spreadsheets that are full of hope as opposed to data. Instead, you might do something like what Google did when they started their self-driving car program. So when they started thinking about it, Larry Page and Sergey Brin said to the team, I'll give you 2 years, and what I want you to do is to drive 1,000 miles. Build me a car that can drive 1,000 miles by itself. And I don't want just any 1,000 miles. I want interesting miles. And he came up with 10 use cases. Can it go over all the Bay Bridges? Can it navigate Lombard Street? Can it take a drive down Highway 1? And after those 1,000 miles, they said, after it was able to do those 1,000 miles, they said, okay, now see if it can drive 100,000 miles. Right? And it wasn't until it drove 100,000 miles that any of us heard about it. that they made any plans for what they might do for after that. Right. Because when you're looking at disruptive innovation, things that your company doesn't know very well and the market isn't ready for, it's not about finding a place in the future and driving towards it. It's about cycle time, about how many learning cycles you can get into the process. So a lot of organizations are now diving into the race for driverless cars. But Google has gone through 7 generations of its cars. It's now driving 20 to 25,000 miles a week on real-world roads and highways. It's collectively driven 3.5 million miles. Last year in California, which is sort of the epicenter of the race for driverless cars, Google drove 30 times more miles than all of its competitors combined. 30 times more miles than all of its competitors combined. That's the learning process it's given and how fast it's iterating across it. In simulation mode, where they take all that case data and reapply it to new software and new developments, they're doing 3 million miles a day in simulation mode and more than 3 billion miles. More than 3 billion miles in simulation overall. That's real learning. And as you might have seen, they're in the process of deploying a fleet of self-driving cars in Phoenix, and there's rumors of a big announcement of going commercial in the next 6 months. So in innovation overall, in both this race and the ones you'll be facing, it's the fastest learner who wins. So just quickly, lesson number 5. Cultivating a sense of patient urgency. In innovation, you're always balancing against 2 tensions. One is that if you don't get the market timing right, almost nothing else matters. The second tension, however, is that precise timing is a fool's errand. You can never get it right. So the question is, when you're in a disruptive environment with lots of uncertainties, do you have the audacity, the urgency, to work in a big opportunity space, while at the same time having the patience for waiting for the right environmental conditions to launch? So, 2 quick examples. First, when Reed Hastings started Netflix, he knew that the future was people watching movies streamed over the internet. That's why he called it Netflix. But he didn't bet his company on that vision. He worked on streaming video, various technologies for streaming video for 10 years. Coming close to pulling the trigger on some and always pulling back because he determined that the market wasn't ready. And at the same time, he built a gigantic subscription-based business around mail-order DVDs. And when the technology was ready, when the market was ready, when the regulatory conditions were ready, he launched and moved very fast. Sir James Dyson, the inventor of the Dyson vacuum cleaner, 5,120 iterations before he got to the first manufacturable Cyclone vacuum cleaner. Over 5,000 iterations before he was ready and went to sweep the marketplace with more than 50% share in a lot of markets. That's the nature of disruptive innovation. You have to sense the opportunity, work at it, and be ready, as opposed to wait for the opportunity and jump in once it's ready because you'll be late. So you can't get the timing precisely, but as Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. So I'll leave you with 5 questions. Are you embracing the gap as you think about the capabilities in the future? Is your organization embracing that gap? Are you thinking about that gap in the context of your customer needs? Are you personally thinking about that gap and what it means for your own actions, your own opportunities, your own challenges? Are you thinking big enough? And after you thought big enough, do you have a mechanism for starting small? And are you set up to learn fast? And does your organization cultivate a sense of patient urgency? Because that's the key, right? Working on it and being ready when the market is ready. Thank you. So we don't really have the environment for interactions, but I welcome questions. Feel free to drop me a note, and feel free to drop me a note if you'd like a copy of the slides. Thanks again.